The African Development Bank has called on African nations to take strategic positions in the global energy transition by shifting from raw mineral exports to processing and value addition. The AfDB President, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, in a statement stressed Africa's role in supplying strategic minerals needed for clean energy technologies.
There's a quiet revolution stirring across Africa. It's not being fought with protests or politics, but with products. And at the heart of it lies a simple question. What if Africa stopped exporting its future and started trading it with itself? For decades, the world has known Africa as a supplier of cocoa, of coffee, of cotton, of gold. But behind the sheen of global trade lies a bitter truth. Africa rarely gets to enjoy the full value of what it produces. Take cocoa, for instance. Countries like Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire are the world's top exporters of raw cocoa beans. Yet they import chocolate, often made with their own cocoa, at 3 to 4 times the price. The same pattern repeats across commodities. Africa exports raw, unprocessed goods and imports them back as finished products, paying far more than what it originally earned. It's like a family with a backyard full of fresh fruit sending their children to buy canned juice from next door. Why does this happen? Much of it traces back to colonial-era trade systems that were never dismantled. Railroads were built not to link African countries together, but to funnel resources straight to the coast for export to Europe. To this day, that design lingers. The infrastructure favors exit over exchange. The result? African countries trade far more with Europe, China, and the US than they do with one another. In fact, just around 16% of Africa's total trade happens within the continent. In comparison, intra-European trade is nearly 68%. Even Asia, with its diversity of economies and geographies, manages over 59%. But here's what most people don't realize. When African countries do trade among themselves, the game changes. Roughly 42% of intra-African trade involves manufactured goods, things that add value, create jobs, and build industries. That's nearly 3 times higher than Africa's export profile to the rest of the world, which is dominated by raw commodities. And this isn't just theory. Countries are already making the shift. Rwanda, for example, was once heavily dependent on exporting coffee, tea, and tin. But policymakers there asked a different question. What else can we make? What else can we trade? They identified over 100 new products that didn't require much land, weren't perishable, and could be scaled quickly. Today, Rwanda exports packaged coffee avocado oil, honey leather goods, textiles, and natural cosmetics, not just to Europe, but increasingly to countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria. Tanzania is doing something similar. Instead of shipping out raw coffee, it's packaging and branding its own blends, selling them directly to North African markets like Algeria. These goods aren't competing with multinational tech firms or luxury European brands. They're competing in spaces where African producers can actually win. In a continent where 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land lies unused, Africa still spends over $35 billion a year importing food. That's a contradiction. And it's not a mistake. It's a system. But that system is beginning to break. Enter the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA. Launched officially in 2021, it's one of the largest free trade areas in the world, bringing together 54 countries, 1.2 billion people, and over $3 trillion in combined GDP. The aim? To dismantle trade barriers between African nations, reduce tariffs, streamline customs procedures, and build a single continental market. In practice, that means a Ghanaian chocolate maker sourcing cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire and selling directly to stores in Kenya. It means a Nigerian fabric company buying cotton from Burkina Faso and shipping finished garments to South Africa without layers of paperwork and border delays. Some argue that the hurdles are too big. Bad roads, inconsistent regulations, corrupt customs systems. But others see something else. Opportunity. Because where there's inefficiency, there's room to innovate. One-stop border posts are already reducing wait times from days to hours. Digital trade platforms are helping small businesses reach new customers across borders. And regional infrastructure projects are linking ports, highways, and power grids in ways that haven't been attempted since independence. The broader impact? Value that once leaked out of the continent is now circulating within. Jobs that once existed only in European or Chinese factories are now being created in African towns. skills, technology, branding, all of it begins to take root locally. Still, there are powerful forces resistant to this shift. Multinational corporations that rely on cheap African raw materials have little incentive to see the continent build its own manufacturing base. Some economists even warn that African nations shouldn't duplicate efforts, suggesting instead they focus on what they're already good at, growing crops, mining minerals. But this isn't just about comparative advantage. It's about self-determination, about dignity, about a continent writing its own economic story after generations of having it dictated from outside. The truth is, no one's coming to build Africa's future for it, but African nations trading with each other. That's how a future gets built. The shift is already happening, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. In Kigali, in Lagos, in Accra and Nairobi, local entrepreneurs are waking up to the fact that the biggest market they've been ignoring is the one right next door. And they're starting to ask new questions. What if we sourced locally? What if we sold across the border? What if our businesses weren't just national, but continental? It's a shift in mindset, and it's one that could redefine the 21st century, not just for Africa, but for the world. Because when 1.2 billion people begin to trade with one another, build with one another, grow with one another, the ripple effects go far beyond commerce. They touch everything: politics, culture, identity, power, and perhaps most importantly, hope. Not long ago, a small team in Africa announced something that didn't make international headlines, but should have. They launched a diaper manufacturing business. Not imported, not foreign-owned, but African-made, African-owned, and designed to serve African families. At first glance, diapers might not seem like a revolutionary product, but behind that simple necessity lies a profound shift in thinking. Every day, millions of parents across Africa buy diapers. Most are imported, produced in factories thousands of kilometers away and priced higher than many families can afford. The profits? They don't stay here. The raw materials? Sourced elsewhere. And the jobs? Created in someone else's economy. But this new venture flipped the script. By building a local supply chain, sourcing materials from within the region, and distributing directly to African retailers, this business did more than sell a product. It kept money in local hands. It created jobs. It sparked a sense of ownership and possibility. It also asked a much larger question: why stop at diapers? Why not build African solutions for African needs? This is the heartbeat of intra-African trade. Not charity, not aid, but practical business decisions that connect production to consumption across borders, cultures, and economies. It's what happens when Africans begin to create for themselves and for each other, rather than always depending on global suppliers. But this isn't just a business success story. It's part of a growing wave of change spreading across the continent, a movement backed not only by visionaries but by policy. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, is more than a trade agreement. It's a blueprint for reinvention. Before AfCFTA, African entrepreneurs often struggled with absurd barriers. Imagine having to pay heavy import taxes just to sell goods in the next country, or dealing with paperwork so tangled, a shipment of t-shirts could take longer to clear customs in Africa than to cross the Atlantic. AfCFTA is changing that. Its goal is to create a single African market, a place where goods, services, and ideas can move freely. If it succeeds, it could lift tens of millions out of poverty and reshape Africa's economic map. But it's not enough to have a good policy on paper. The real test is what happens on the ground, and that's where these small, determined businesses come in. Rwanda has shown what's possible. After decades of being pigeonholed as a producer of raw coffee and tea, the country began shifting toward value-added exports. They targeted non-perishable niche products that didn't need huge tracts of land or heavy machinery. The result? A diversified portfolio of goods: avocado oil, honey, packaged teas, leather crafts, natural cosmetics, and crucially, markets within Africa began opening up. The country now trades directly with Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and others. That means more stability. When one global partner falters, African markets offer alternatives. That kind of flexibility is critical, especially in a world where economic shocks ripple fast. Tanzania, too, is redefining its economy. Once known primarily for its raw agricultural exports, it's now developing industries around those same resources. Tanzanian coffee isn't just leaving in sacks anymore. It's leaving in bags with labels, branding, and marketing done at home. That means more money stays with the producer, and more opportunity flows into rural communities. Here's why this matters. When value stays on the continent, it multiplies. A raw cotton exporter might earn $1 per kilo, but process that cotton into thread, the value goes up. Turn it into fabric, higher still. Transform it into clothing. Now you're talking jobs, design, logistics, and retail. Every step of the value chain that stays in Africa is a step toward economic independence. And the ripple effects extend far beyond manufacturing. When people work in stable industries, they spend, local demand increases, schools and healthcare improve, innovation accelerates. What starts as a factory often becomes the foundation for something far greater: community resilience. That's why intra-African trade isn't just about numbers, it's about dignity. For too long, Africa's economic narrative has been one of extraction, of shipping out potential and buying back power. That model hasn't worked. It's kept Africa vulnerable to price shocks, foreign policies, and global supply chain disruptions. The COVID-19 pandemic made that painfully clear, but now the tide is shifting. In Kenya, solar startups are exporting clean energy solutions to West Africa. In Nigeria, tech hubs are building platforms for cross-border logistics. In South Africa, manufacturers are finding new markets in East and Central Africa. These aren't isolated stories, they're signals of something bigger, a continental awakening. Of course, none of this is easy. Infrastructure is still a hurdle. In some cases, it remains cheaper to ship a container from Lagos to Europe than to another African capital. Regulatory complexity, corruption, and limited access to financing continue to slow progress. And global interests still benefit from keeping Africa as a supplier, not a competitor. But something is different now. Young entrepreneurs across the continent are choosing to stay and build. Governments are starting to see local production not just as an economic lever, but as a matter of national security. And in community after community, people are beginning to believe in something they haven't always had: the possibility of self-reliance. So what does all this mean for the average person? It means better access to products made with local understanding. It means jobs that don't require leaving home. It means pride in goods that say, "Made in Africa," and mean it. And for those in the diaspora, it means an invitation, not just to send money back home, but to invest in something that's being built with vision and intent. Intra-African trade offers a way to connect culturally, economically, and emotionally with the continent, not just as an origin, but as a future. The diaper factory that started this story, it's just one of many. More are coming. Food processing centers, textile workshops, tech startups, construction material manufacturers, all driven by Africans who are done waiting for permission, done waiting for someone else to fix it, done exporting their future in exchange for borrowed dreams. They are building, quietly, boldly, together. And in doing so, they are answering the question that echoes across this continent: what kind of Africa do we want? An Africa that builds for itself, an Africa that trades with itself, an Africa that finally sees itself, not through the lens of dependency, but with the clarity of power, purpose, and shared prosperity. There's something quietly seismic happening beneath the headlines, and it's not coming from Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. It's coming from Accra, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Lagos, and Kigali. It's the realization that Africa's future doesn't lie in trade deals written in foreign capitals, but in the connections forged between neighbors. For years, Africa's global economic position was built on dependence. Dependence on aid, dependence on foreign markets, dependence on external validation. But dependence doesn't build power, it dilutes it. In 2025, that story is being rewritten by Africans trading with Africans. Let's talk about positioning. When African countries trade primarily with Europe or China, the terms of trade, the rules of the game, are set by those who have more leverage. And often that means Africa exports its raw materials cheaply, only to re-import them at inflated prices. But intra-African trade changes the equation. When Nigeria trades with Ethiopia or Kenya trades with Senegal, those terms are negotiated among equals. There's room for mutual growth, regional specialization, and shared value creation. No outside power dictating the flow. No one exploiting the imbalance of wealth or industrial capacity, just African nations discovering what they can truly do for each other. As African nations trade more internally, they become more resilient to global shocks. A tariff hike in the United States or a manufacturing freeze in China doesn't bring the entire continent's supply chain to a halt. Diversification, not just of products but of partners, is what real economic security looks like, and it's already paying off. In the wake of global economic instability in 2024, some African businesses that relied heavily on Western suppliers were caught in chaos. Delays, shortages, surging prices, but those who had local or regional supply chains kept moving. That's not just luck, that's the power of intra-African trade in action. Infrastructure gaps are one of the most pressing. Many African roads remain unpaved, ports are overloaded, rail systems are outdated or non-existent. The cost of moving goods across borders can still be astronomical, especially when bureaucratic red tape adds weeks to basic shipments. In some countries, corruption at border posts eats into profits. In others, conflicting standards on packaging, safety, documentation create costly delays. And for small businesses, access to finance continues to be a high barrier. Big dreams are hard to realize without startup capital. But even here, progress is visible. Smart logistics startups are offering tech solutions to cut border delays. Regional infrastructure corridors are linking countries like never before. Harmonized customs frameworks are being tested. Even digital currencies are being explored to reduce dependence on foreign exchange for intra-African transactions. What's most exciting, though, is the human factor. A new generation of African entrepreneurs doesn't see borders as barriers, they see them as bridges. They're building apps that connect Nigerian farmers with Ghanaian buyers. They're creating platforms for artisans in Uganda to sell directly to consumers in Botswana. They're not asking for handouts, they're building networks. And that matters more than any one policy. Because when Africans begin to imagine their economic future through a continental lens, it forces a shift in everything. In education, in industry, in technology, in leadership. You stop planning for survival and start planning for scale. Take a moment to imagine what this could look like at its full potential. Zambian copper is refined in Zambia and turned into wiring for Ghanaian-made electronics. Ethiopian leather becomes high-end bags sold in Nairobi malls and Johannesburg boutiques. Cameroonian engineers collaborate with Egyptian manufacturers on affordable solar panels distributed across the Sahel. Senegalese software developers build fintech solutions that power retail in Malawi. This isn't a fantasy. The pieces are already moving, but it's going to take more than just good intentions. It's going to take belief and participation. So the question becomes, where do you fit in? If you're an entrepreneur, are you looking beyond your borders? If you're in the diaspora, are you investing in businesses that keep African money in African hands? If you're a consumer, are you choosing local or regional alternatives where you can? Because here's the hard truth. As long as Africa continues to export raw materials and import finished goods, it will remain stuck in a cycle of underdevelopment. But when African nations start owning every part of the value chain, production, branding, logistics, sales, that's when real independence begins. And make no mistake, the rest of the world is watching. Some are cheering, others are nervous, because a self-sufficient Africa, a wealthy, united, trading Africa, is a shift in global power dynamics. And not everyone benefits from that, but Africa does. So what's at stake isn't just economics, it's sovereignty, it's dignity, it's the chance to finally break free from the economic structures built during colonization and reinforced during globalization. That's why this matters. This isn't just a diaper factory in one town, or a shipment of coffee beans in new packaging. It's not just chocolate bars with African branding or honey jars on supermarket shelves. This is a movement, a new economic story, a story where African wealth doesn't leak out, it circulates. Where skills don't stagnate, they multiply. Where young people don't flee, they build. Where value doesn't vanish, it stays. And it begins with something as simple as a trade deal, a partnership, a border crossing, a belief that we can do this together. So if you're still wondering whether this vision is realistic, just look around. It's already happening. In factories, in farms, in markets, in boardrooms, in homes. Africa isn't waiting anymore. It's moving, with purpose, with pride, and with power. Now we want to hear from you. What product from another African country would you love to see in your local market? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. And if this story inspired you or made you think differently, please like this video to support this message. Share it with someone who believes in Africa's potential. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update on this journey toward African economic freedom. Because the only way we go far is together.